busy. It's so sad.
That's okay. I don't know, make it go back to the. I'm going to do this laptop HDMI. See if it'll switch.
I don't know if it has like a little thingy doodle to advance the slides or not.
I can just gesture in.
There's not one in here. Unless Thea has one.
Didn't they just have an elephant eye at Riverbanks?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard
I
about
think
that.
they did.
I don't know.
Sad.
They don't let him be at Greenville anymore.
Oh my gosh, that's the tiniest zoo I've ever been to in my life. The first time I went there, we like did a lap, and I'm like,
Is that
where's,
all?
where's the rest of it? Because we used to live in
Zoo my
Columbia.
whole life.
Yeah, I mean, we like used to live in Columbia, so we would always go to Riverbanks.
Yeah,
and
it's a
so
decent zoo.
I just didn't know it was so small. I mean, it's adorable.
Right.
You know, you can go through the whole thing in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
We went this winter. The majority of the weren't even
Right.
out.
There's only like 5 interesting things there.
And we were like, man, this sucks. We like came all the way here and.
I think you're all good.
Is it and it shows recording?
It says on the screen up there, you see the little red dot. You probably can't see it on that screen. It stays long.
Okay.
In the top right corner, there's a little red dot.
Okay.
And also the lady just recorded.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I heard it. And then what does she need to do to turn it off at the end?
Just hold down power off. Well, actually, yeah. So just hold down power off and it'll switch screens and there'll be another power off button. You can use the computer on. I'm not using the computer, so it doesn't matter.
So we just need to call CCIT and ask them how to make it disconnected if it doesn't work through here.
I don't think it's going to be using the computer, so.
If I plug it in now. What we have to do on a weekly basis.
Right. I mean, it should stay plugged in. We got it once you do this part's
I doubt she wants to just leave that in there because she bought it. Yeah, it's probably. Yeah. She probably wants to store it.
Yeah, we can have to ask her.
And I will send it once. You know, there's a way to talk about like using binary and things like black and white.
And this is an active microphone.
I guess. There's an article definitely. So they say you can use it today. It's a way to use like a macro plugin to install.
When you say the macro plugin.
So it's basically just like it's just.
Yeah, that's probably what they've been using, and it doesn't pick up really well.
Right, especially for
And you can do it instead of like black and white.
Thanks, Tina. It was nice to meet you. If this works,
yeah, it's like, it's easier to batch it. Batch it. I have it when he has it trying to get on the computer. There's definitely some error with it. I don't know if the error is that bad. Yeah, like if everything's standardized, it's all the same kind of
Yeah, I mean, I would say
yeah, because of course we're gonna try to do that. I got it installed.
Like the it's just the brand. So I contacted them. So you can get access to it when you decide you're in trouble.
And then just let me know when
Yeah, so easy.
For this. Okay, we're striking out. Alright, so just do it regular. So we're gonna just do it regular. She said she'll talk loud. You don't have to scream or anything. And I'll get in touch with CCIT and find out. Make sure.
Sorry for let's just do it.
yeah.
It's not.
They'll be taxed.
I don't know what I'm doing.
We can still do it. Risk trying to, the board is trying to
No, not the ones that
I mean, unless you want to use those photos and you take also from Camp Koja, test it too, then yeah, it's not
for the sake of getting like that distance,
yeah.
the boundary. I don't know. But that's.
I know.
If we went to like
We might.
big
Yeah.
because then you can say parking spaces.
We just need to call because like the outreach units are everything that's like a make dinner is called start us with know where to tell them to call and before they're
So it's 117.
how far would I go?
Right. So you just need
But I don't know.
a fixed pole.
So technically goes into something that's visible.
I tell them to building, so those could be like,
Go ahead and get started.
but the problem is like sometimes they might be how far because
I think for sure.
Okay, well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christie Sampson. I am a postdoc in Dr. Rodriguez's lab. I have been studying Asian elephants as part of the Smithsonian and throughout my master's and PhD here at Clemson. And then my postdoc has kind of been a continuation of the projects that we developed during that time. So I'm going to share with you guys a little bit of the work that we've been doing. If you have any questions, like while we're going through it, feel free to raise your hand and I can answer them while we go. So before I get started, whenever I say we, it really incorporates a whole lot of people. So I just want to point them out in the beginning. They have here, Dr. Tonka over Biosci was my master's and PhD advisor. Dr. Rodriguez in this department is my postdoc advisor. And then I work with the Smithsonian, WWF, San Diego Zoo Global as some of my big research partners. And then local communities I work a lot with, and then also some NGOs. So this is the we that I'm referring to. Today I'm going to be covering a little bit of the background about Myanmar. Some 4 different projects I'm going to kind of skim over and hit the highlights so that you guys can kind of see the breadth of the research that we're doing there. I'm going to talk about the direct and indirect impacts that we were looking at in Myanmar, our somewhat failed movement ecology projects, and then perception of poaching. So if anyone saw last year's disasterology seminar, it'll be a little bit more about that. So just to get us situated, Asia has some of the highest human population densities in the world. And keep this in mind when we switch to the next one, because this is where Asian elephants used to live. So you can see how much their range has contracted from where it used to be along the salmon color, just down to these dark red spots now. So they have lost a lot of land, and currently are in 13 countries across Asia, with an estimated population of between 20 and 50,000 wild Asian elephants left. So where my work is focused in Myanmar, and it's over there next to China, Bangladesh, Thailand, and India. And they are very diverse people. So these are a whole bunch of the women that I work with. By the numbers, the country is a little over 261 square miles. Myanmar does use miles. It's one of the few other countries that does. So you'll see if I've submitted a map to the government, it might have miles on the bottom instead of kilometers, just because I didn't feel like changing it. So the country has about 53 million people, and they are divided into 135 different ethnic groups. The primary or dominant ethnic group are the Bamar, and they are the people that I generally work with in the center part of Myanmar. For those of you who know genocide going on, the Rohingya, that's over there, and the orange spots, and then the border over there with China, there's a lot of the illegal activities, illegal wildlife trafficking kind of occurs over on that side. So humans and elephants in Myanmar and kind of across Asia, they have a very close working relationship, especially in Myanmar. In Myanmar, they're used for labor and transportation of people and objects. They were a dominant force in the timber industry for Myanmar. They helped put them on the map for that. Not quite Oliphant times, but elephants were used as part of the military for thousands of years. Hannibal led his 40 Asian elephants over the Alps. Not very many of them survived, but more currently, elephants were an important part of World War II in the Burma theater and helping the troops out there. So Myanmar in particular, in the 1940s, there were approximately 10,000 wild Asian elephants, but after decades of conscripting elephants into the timber industry and for other labor uses, and then extensive habitat loss, like was demonstrated in that earlier picture, that number dropped to an estimated 1,400 to 2,000 elephants, and this is our most recent number. So the two spots that I spend a lot of time in are the Bago Yuma, so that's this center area right here, this mountain range just north of the former capital of Yangon, and then over here in the Irrawaddy Delta. Both of those areas are within the elephant range, which is that blue spot, and have high levels of human-elephant conflict. This is kind of the landscape where I work. It's a mosaic of rice paddies and forested areas with a little bit of houses sprinkled in between. These work? Okay. And I'm going to show you a little bit about the... Oh, no. Oh, no, did I break it? Well, I was going to show you a little bit about the habitat loss, but guess not. So, suffice to say, there has been a lot of forest cover lost in that central region of Myanmar as new dams were put in, new agriculture has been occurring. So that first topic that I want to talk to you guys about, the direct impacts of human-elephant conflicts. So when we talk about human-elephant conflicts, there are a lot of other terms that people use. For the sake of ease, I use human-elephant conflict, but there's also human-elephant coexistence, human-human conflict, all of which have slightly different meanings. But for today, human-elephant conflicts happens when humans and elephants compete for the same habitat and resources. So the point of this project was to really get into the country for the first time after 10 years of international researchers being excluded from doing work in Myanmar. Myanmar was under a dictatorship for a long period of time in which no one was able to get into the country and kind of look at the wildlife. So this project was one of the first ones for the Smithsonian to go back in after the 10-year absence from when they were working there in 2001 and 2004. This started back up in 2014. So our first goals were kind of figure out what major obstacles people were experiencing in some of these rural communities where they had that human-wildlife conflict and what they thought was holding them back from improving their lives. We wanted to see the severity and types of human-elephant conflict these people were experiencing. We wanted to see what people thought about elephants in general and kind of figure out which mitigation strategies to address those problems that we found were most likely to be successful. So we did this through an interview survey. We went out and questioned a whole bunch of people. We asked them about 31 questions, and these were usually open-ended or yes or no questions. And so we did that right here in the south part of the Bagua, partially because it was really easy to get to from Yangon, where most of the traffic or entry into the country happens. There are high levels of human-elephant conflict, and we also knew that further on we were going to be doing an elephant collaring project in this area. So we wanted to go in and see if people were going to be hating the elephants and if our project was going to be made harder by local attitudes. A small thing. So most of the villages that I looked at were inside the elephant range, but there were two that were outside that we kind of used as controls. It wasn't quite a big enough sample size, but just to give us a little bit of comparison. And so we did 31 conflict villages and those two that were outside the elephant range. We interviewed over 300 adults. Most of them were farmers. Farming is the predominant occupation in the area. 83 were the non-farmers, and then in those two non-conflict villages, we talked to about 15 farmers. So, to our surprise, we thought that elephants were going to be the biggest issue in these villages that we were going to talk about human-elephant conflict. But instead, a lot of people actually said poverty is our biggest issue in these areas. About 75% of farmers and 84% of non-farmers. Their second biggest obstacle to improving their lives for farmers was threats and damage from animals, including elephants. However, our non-farmers, only 1% of those people said that elephants and other animals posed a major threat to them, or a major obstacle to improving their life. However, both groups of people also said that lack of infrastructure was a big issue for them to making their lives better. When we came to talk about the types of human-elephant conflicts those people were experiencing, these were the major types. We have crop breeding over here, and then property damage. So in this used to be a house. A monk was sleeping in there, and during the night, an elephant came through, crashed into the building, knocked it over, and the monk ended up dying. The family was gone, thankfully, during the night when the elephant went in. It went in to get tamarind that they had been storing in their house, completely destroying their structure, and the family ended up having to move in with relatives because their entire place was destroyed. So in these areas, when we asked them specifically about human-elephant conflict, farmers reported that it was either a major or moderate problem for them. Non-farmers said that it was either a major or moderate problem, primarily. And the farmers said it was primarily due to crop and property damage, whereas non-farmers said it was mostly an issue about property damage or safety. So when we were asking the farmers, 38% of the people that we talked to said that they had lost half or more of their crop the previous year. So these people do not make a lot of money. The average salary is around $1,000 to $1,200. And most of their neighbors are also in a similar situation. So when 38% of the people in a village in an area lose all of their income for a year, it can have a devastating impact on the community. But interestingly, 2/3 of the farmers that we talked to in those conflict communities said that elephants were the only animals causing damage to their crop. When we went to those two non-conflict villages, they reported similar amounts of damage, but they didn't have elephants. So one of the things that we wanted to look forward in the future was making sure that people are actually attributing correct damage to whoever is actually causing the damage. In the case of the non-conflict areas, it was usually drought or insect damage. Another thing that we did while we were in this area was we created a Landcover map of the villages. So what we did was we took satellite imagery, looked at all of the area around the villages within a 1 kilometer buffer, and then either assigned it one of these Landcover classes so that we could compare villages that reported high amounts of conflict to those who reported low amounts of conflict to kind of see if land cover could be one of the drivers for those different areas. And what we thought was potentially elephants would be drawn to either rice paddy or sugarcane, maybe not so much to forested areas, and probably drawn to water. However, the only thing that actually came back as significant was sugarcane. And this potentially is because sugarcane is a product that grows all year round and has very high calorie available for the elephants. So they tended to report longer and higher non-flu severity. However, we found that both farmers and non-farmers supported conservation in this area. And they said that they wanted to conserve elephants because it's an important part of nature and it's important for their religion. When we asked them why elephants attack people, they said it was accidentally to get to different food sources because humans were encroaching onto elephant habitat. And then also we had this really interesting story of the vampire elephant. So we had a woman who had stored her rice in a platform up in a tree, which is typically like we do with barebacks. Unfortunately, she had decided to sleep next to that rice. And when the elephant came to bring down the branch to bring down the rice for it to eat, it also brought down the woman. And she unfortunately did not survive the incident. But during it, she had lost almost all of during her injuries were very severe. She lost almost all of her blood. And therefore, the story started going around from that village throughout the entire 2 different townships that there was a vampire elephant going out to drink people's blood. And that's still a story that I hear 4 years later when I'm working in this area. When we talked about mitigation methods, what people were currently doing was elephant drives. So that's when you stand behind an elephant for a really long time and shout at it or try to physically move it with a car or a tractor. And spending the evenings in tree huts, again, trying to scare elephants out of your area. But what they really wanted was to remove all elephants from the area and or improve physical barriers. So this kind of told us removing all elephants from the area is not a feasible thing, at least for us, but we can work to improve physical barriers. Non-farmers currently using physical barriers and deterrence, but they really wanted to improve those physical barriers and improve their deterrence. So using things like electric fencing instead of hanging wire fences with CDs that shine and sometimes scare elephants away, but most of the time don't. Most of them felt that the government was responsible. However, 95% of them were willing to contribute time and or labor to working on these projects, which demonstrated a desire in the community to work with us to keep elephants and conserve elephants in the region, despite all of the different problems that they were undergoing. So people are willing to conserve elephants. If we can find some mitigation strategies that address poverty more effectively than just addressing, might be more effective than just addressing HEC as a standalone issue. Also, one of the follow-up projects that came out of this was I went out and worked with the community to teach people how to install electric fences. So we spent months doing capacity building in creating these electric fences around villages and around crops, which helped to do a little bit of job creation as well as protect their crops, which was 100% successful thus far. Elephants have not figured out how to bring our fences down, though elephants in other areas, there's one in Sri Lanka where we work who pushes females. He'll just like body check a female into the fence and she'll knock it over and then he'll walk over her to get into the crop. The one thing that we're really worried about is if conflict increases, it can lead to poaching. So we want to make sure that people support conservation, but also we can stop poaching from occurring. So those are the direct impacts. And if you saw Diane's seminar earlier this year, she also talked about the indirect impacts. And indirect impacts are basically all of those things that follow down from our direct impacts. So our direct impacts, things like injury, fatality, crop, livestock loss. But the hidden impacts or indirect impacts are things that are really hard to quantify, they're hard to see. So it's the stress that you feel from knowing that you might potentially run into an elephant. It's the time you have to spend to rebuild your house or to actually go to the government to ask for compensation when an elephant destroys your land. And so we wanted to see what type of indirect impacts people are experiencing across this landscape and assess the conservation attitudes of those affected community members. And this really started because when we were out going to catch elephants for our GPS collaring project. Usually by the time that I got up, the children were already off and out to school. But on one particular morning, these kids were still hanging around the house that we were staying at. And it was because there was an elephant near the village. And so the families were really afraid to send their kids down the half a mile to the school because they were afraid they were going to get hurt by the elephants. And so what we wanted to do was figure out kind of how often are these types of issues happening in these communities. So the uniqueness of this project is that it was huge. This survey design was massive. We asked people about everything we could possibly think of. Everything from what they knew about elephants to their specific experiences with elephants to how they felt it impacted their children to how they thought they were impacted and their risks, the potential risks that they had to live through, as well as their conservation attitudes. A lot of different projects that have happened thus far focus on talking to 10 different people really in depth, or to a small group of people in a focus interview. But this allowed us, by asking all of these questions in a quantitative way, we could kind of assess the impact over a larger area. I'm not going to tell you about all of this because it was over 500 questions, and nobody wants to be here all day. So I'm just going to hit the highlights, but it was a mix of open-ended yes-no questions, and then we used the 5-point Likert scale that everyone is very familiar with. So again, we did surveys in these two areas, Bago Yuma and the Irrawaddy Delta. We did 381 interviews. I was just there in December last year doing it, and Dr. Rodriguez and I are going back in November to go up near Mandalay to do another version of this survey. But we did 381 interviews, average age of 47, mostly male, mostly farmers. So some highlights from what people knew about elephants. We asked them 11 questions about what do they know about elephant diets, elephant behaviors, elephant conservation status. Only 75% got 6 or more correct. It's 50, not a great showing. But 82% did know that elephants had lost habitat because of human activities. Only 42% knew that Asian elephants were endangered. So this showed us that there are some key areas where we can go in and do some education and outreach in these communities. When we asked people specifically about crop guarding, 50% of the people guarded their crops all night long, and these people were staying up all night. And they used things to scare elephants away, including playing the guitar, yelling, playing rap music, one of my favorites. But however, only 29% of those people thought that what they were doing was actually effective. 60% of the people said that it prevented them from getting enough sleep, and 61% said that it made them more susceptible to illness. And this is probably backed up by fact, because when these guys were out during dusk all night and then early in the morning, that's when mosquitoes are off. So and this area has a lot of dengue, has a lot of malaria, has a lot of chikungunya that these people are exposed to in higher frequency than potentially other people. So these people said it took time away from other activity, that they could not expand their farm because they were afraid elephants were going to destroy it, and they could not expand the types of crops that they were going to grow that would be more expensive and bring them more money because they're afraid, again, elephants would eat it. How many people, roughly 30 people, 35 people in here today? So if you guys were representative of my sample, at least one of you would have lost a sibling, a parent, a child, a grandchild to an elephant. If we were, my sample size in Myanmar. A lot of people, or some of the comments that we got from the people was that their family was suffering because of the elephants, while another person commented that there was nothing special they could do because it's just luck of when an elephant killed a person. These people reported that they had to make up more for the loss of income. They had to work additionally, which made them more susceptible to illness, and that it reduced the amount of time they could spend with their kids and time they had available to sleep. 8 people reported being injured by elephants. They thought they were also more susceptible to illnesses. They lost sleep due to post-traumatic stress and ongoing pain. They had to work more. Their family members had to work more to make up for their income loss, and it reduced the amount of time they had to spend caring for their children. Speaking of kids, 63% of the people thought that their children, or reported their children were constantly afraid of elephants. 26% of the kids missed school because of elephants being in the area, and 55% believed that their kids had a lower quality of life because they lived near elephants. So this is a pretty cool, one of my favorite parts of the study. So these are pairs of statements that we asked the people, or said to people, and they're risk perception questions. So if I say that I'm afraid of swimming in the ocean because I'm afraid a shark will come and eat me, I'm always afraid of that, even though I really know that that's probably not going to happen. And that's something that we ended up seeing here, where a lot of people said that they were afraid something was going to happen, but a much lower percentage thought that it would actually come to fruition in the future. So when we asked our conservation questions, everyone agreed elephants should be protected in Myanmar, and that they're an important part, or it's important to protect elephant habitat. And they disagreed that it was a waste of money for the Myanmar government to protect habitat, to protect elephants. So almost everyone that we talked to, they experienced some type of indirect impact. However, this type of conflict is something that's not really undergoing any mitigation. However, people still wanted to protect elephants, and so we were able to suggest different ways that the government and NGOs could contribute to mitigating human-elephant conflict through education, physical and mental facilities, and opportunities for people to seek help in those areas. And so movement ecology was really the chapter on my dissertation that I was super excited to get into, because we were going to catch elephants and put GPS collars on them, and it was going to be awesome. So this project was designed to look at, to monitor elephant movements, see where they're going before or after a human-elephant conflict event, determine how effective our mitigation methods were, and then answer some of our broad landscape use questions, like how do they use landscape with different crop resources, availabilities, changing daily seasonal movement habits, etc. So what we did was we collared a whole bunch of elephants. I am still not that talented. Like, I can barely hold on to the back of the elephant, but that guy's awesome. So we ended up collaring 15 elephants in the first 3 years. We were getting back hourly positions, and I brought, this is one of the newer collars. If anyone wants to check it out. This is the battery. So this is the battery, this big gray part, and then this is the electronic section right here. And this is actually designed to hang under an elephant, which does not work well in our system, which we discovered later. So the other models have a counterweight that goes under the neck, and then that rests on the back, which works better, at least in the forested areas. But you guys can check that out and imagine twice the weight. And carrying that through the jungle was not fun. And so some of the data that we got back, every different color up here is a different elephant, and so every dot or marker is a 1 hour difference in time. And so we found some cool things. We saw where a bunch of elephants congregated, overlapped in their space use at different times. We found some corridors going through, and then blank areas in the map where I still don't know why they're not using some of those areas. We also answered some questions about translocation. So this guy, or one of the ways that people deal with human-elephant conflicts is if a male is causing a problem, they'll tranquilize him, put him on the back of the truck, and drive him far away, which never works. So our guys were causing trouble down here. They drove him, or both of them, up to an elephant sanctuary up there. I have it pointed. And they promptly walked back home. Probably $3,000 to $4,000 a piece later, and they're right back where they started. And so we're using this to try to convince the Myanmar government and other governments that this really does not work. But if you saw the disasterology or disaster peace theater last year, this is where we come in. So I had so much trouble during this project. All of these red arrows are colors that failed. So unfortunately, with that model, the electronics in there are not sensitive enough to pick up the location of the animal, and consequently, we knocked out 7 of our elephants immediately because of color failure. And then we got into our poached elephants. One of my first elephant who ended up dying 3 months after we collared him. The shortest amount of time between collar and poaching happened 3 days afterwards. We were working in the Bago-Yuma Valley, particularly because we did not think that poaching was occurring in that area. So to our surprise, we had a lot of elephants end up poached within that first 3 years and have continued on afterwards. So so these are our elephants that we saw, both collared and uncollared. It's about the size of, I mapped this out on Central. The whole unincorporated Central and Clemson together is about the size of this area. And we found 19 dead elephants in this area. 7 of our collared elephants, 5 we found their carcasses, 2 are missing, but we assume dead or in the wildlife trade. We were able to find 11 uncollared elephant carcasses, and then 1 was a reported kill site by poachers. They told us that they killed an elephant there, but when we went out to search it, we were not able to find the carcass. So when we expanded that from our initial collaring site here, across the different areas where our partners were working, we found more than 70 dead elephants in 2.5 years. So if you think back, estimates are that only 2,000 wild elephants are in Myanmar, and we lost 70 of them in 2.5 years in just those 2 big areas. The one thing that we were not expecting to find was that poachers were going after Asian elephants not for their tusks, but more for their skins. Asian elephants, only the males have tusks. The females sometimes have little tushers, but for the most part, they are tuskless. All of the elephants, except for one that we collared, was tuskless. The worst finding that we had was a mass grave of 20 elephants where the poachers had killed the entire herd and skinned them, and they were just rotting in that pit. So the products that they take from these animals are elephant skin. These are called blood beads. So what happens is they dry the elephant skin and take the subcutaneous layer, polish them into beads, which ward off gastrointestinal diseases, and then more traditional use of body parts for umbrella stands and table legs, etc. Why this is such a big problem is because when you think about elephant poaching for ivory, you think in Asian elephants they can only go after males. But if they're taking the skin from an elephant, they can go after any elephant, which means females and babies. And when we lose females in these populations, they are much more important for the breeding and population stability than males. Males will mate with any female, but if we lose breeding age females, it can have a lot of devastation to local populations. So, not to be all sad, our partners on this project, WWF, and the Myanmar government and elephant family, they really took it on themselves to do this huge anti-poaching campaign. There was benefit concerts, there were huge mass marketing, and they reached over 25 million people through signage in country, but also now whenever you go to the Myanmar airport, it is plastered with anti-poaching messaging for everyone to see. One of the other things that came out of this is we wrote our article was published in PLOS One, but we also translated it for Science Journal for Teens, so that this is actually used and accessed by, I think the last count was 20,000 people for use in the classroom, that people can learn about poaching in Asian elephants. So my movement ecology project actually became a poaching project, and then, of course, follow up. We wanted to know what people thought about poaching, how they were experiencing poaching, what was driving poaching overall. So this was really important for conservation planning. We want to know, did people think elephants were pests, or were they worthy of conservation? How poaching was affecting local people. You might have heard of the Lord's Resistance Army, who uses ivory to fund terrorism. Similarly, ganja weed and al-Shabaab, mostly in Africa. But we also want to look at the differences between rural and urban views to see if people had different experiences in urban areas versus rural areas, so that we could figure out where we needed to target our messaging towards. So our objectives were to assess the differences between these two groups. Oops, that didn't work. Determine their motivations for complying with elephant conservation laws, and then to see how they were experiencing poaching, their knowledge of poaching activities. So again, working in this area down here, we did our surveys, our urban surveys in Yangon, rural surveys in Irrawaddy and the Bago-Yuma. Again, using the Likert scale and the open-ended questions. We did 178 questions. And our first set of questions looked at people's wildlife values. What did they think about wildlife? How important was wildlife to them? What we ended up finding was that urban people had more positive views towards wildlife. So they were more likely to agree that they had a strong emotional bond with wild animals, that hunting was not kind to wild animals, whereas our rural folks were more likely to agree that the main reason why wild animals were here was for people to use, that humans should manage wildlife populations for humans' benefits, and the needs of humans should always take priority over wildlife protection. When we asked about elephants in particular, both urban and rural people had an overall positive attitude, thinking that elephants were important for religious reasons, they were important to the ecosystem, an important part of Myanmar's culture. But rural people were more likely to think that elephants were important for religious reasons, but did not believe it was possible for people to share the same land as elephants, which is probably something you'd expect since they're the ones actually sharing land with elephants. When we asked what they knew about their elephant status in Myanmar, in the urban areas, only 38% of people said that it had decreased. 54% had no idea whether it had increased or decreased. In comparison to rural areas, where 58% of people said that the elephant populations had decreased. Moving on to motivations for complying with the elephant protection laws. Most people agreed that they had a moral obligation to comply with elephant laws, and that people who poached elephants should be punished. 90% of them believed that you would be caught if you killed an elephant, and the punishment for killing an elephant is 7 years in prison. So that's a fairly decent deterrent to killing elephants. However, only 39% of rural people and 15% of urban people said that they really knew wildlife laws. So this is a great area where we can work on improving people's knowledge so that they know what and why the laws are in place. When we asked them what the greatest threats to elephants were, most people said poaching, followed by habitat degradation and destruction, and that was both for urban and rural populations. And then finally, when we wanted to compare the experiences that people in urban and rural areas had with poaching, we were able to find some pretty interesting things. When we asked people if people in Myanmar helped poachers from other countries find elephants, 35% of the people in rural areas said yes, and 56% of the people in the urban areas said yes. When we asked if Myanmar people help poachers avoid capture, 42% of both groups said yes. When we asked if they had ever seen a poacher, only 21% of people in rural areas said that they had ever seen a poacher. Now, why would farmers help poachers if you knew you were going to get sent to jail for 7 years? If we go back to farmers only making about $1,000 a year, $1,000 to $1,200, you can make $4,000 in one go if you help a poacher find an elephant. Elephant skin sells for about $3.56 a square inch. And so if you guys were an elephant, you would be worth a little less than $10,000. One elephant can sell for over $25,000, and this is a very well cleaned elephant, and that's not including all the extra parts, so it's probably on the low end. When we asked people what poachers were taking from elephants, everyone, almost all of the rural people said tusks, or most people said tusks. Rural people were also aware of the skin trade, which was not as well known in the urban areas. Again, a way that we can, as the NGOs and conservation authorities, somewhere where we can go in and teach people this is actually happening and this is why poachers are killing elephants. When we asked if they are afraid of poachers, about half of our rural people said yes. 28% of our urban participants said yes. They said that poachers were greedy, cruel, bloodthirsty people. They bring guns and violence. They're very dangerous to my family, and they can shut my mouth by using a gun. So we saw some big differences in how rural and urban participants view wildlife and elephant conservation, but we were also able to find some easily addressable knowledge gaps where we can go in and help the communities to understand wildlife laws, understand why poachers are taking different parts, and that they are taking different parts. So we were also able to show that the effects of poaching are being felt by both groups, but mostly by rural people who are potentially in real danger from these poaching groups. And we can use this to help the government and other agencies move resources towards people that need them the most. So a little bit of a summary of the different projects we're working on. I started off in direct impacts, moved on to indirect impacts, started an elephant movement project, which became a poaching project, which became the poaching perception project. But that's really only a fraction of the other projects that are going on by our team and other teams. So there's also fecal DNA project going on, an extensive educational and outreach project, an electric fencing project, which I mentioned. But the overall arching thing that we're working toward at the moment is reintroduction. So there was only, as I said, about 2,000 wild elephants, minus all the ones that have been poached. But there are 5,000 captive elephants in Myanmar that belong to either the government or private owners, and they're working on ways that they can take those captive elephants and put them back safely into the environment so that they can start living wildly. So I want to thank everyone for listening. These are various people and our funders, etc.
what do you hope to achieve with the fecal DNA study?
So the original idea was to look at habitual crop breeders. So we were collecting fecal DNA from conflict sites, so we could figure out if it's one or two males, because that's what our hypothesis is, going in, destroying a lot of houses, destroying a lot of crops. When an elephant goes into an area, for every 1 acre that they actually eat of rice paddy, they destroy 12 acres more. So if we can remove 1 or 2 problem males from the equation, it could benefit the rest of the population a lot. Unfortunately, the first year when I went out, we got 300 fecal DNA samples. The next year when we went out, we got about 30. We think it's because of the poaching issue in that area. We can also use it for estimating population size, looking at family groups, etc.
You said that there were private owners of elephants. Can you elaborate a little bit on who those are?
So it's generally wealthier people who would contract their elephants to timber companies or for labor. Like if you need an area plowed or something moved, you just hire the elephant.
You said that in a period of 2.5 years, 70 elephants died. So do you have an estimate on how many poachers were caught during that same period?
In that area, I am only aware of about 15. There was a large poaching ring. That's not true. Okay, so in the Baguyuma, there was about 15. On the Irrawaddy side over by the coast, I think there was at least 30. And part of that was a big ring from Vietnam had a poaching operation in country, and they scooped up a whole bunch of people at once.
Did you pay the respondents to complete the survey?
No, we did not.
It seems almost impossible to get people to complete a 500-question survey.
So you didn't have to answer all of them. What it was is there were 3, like your general sociodemographics, a few questions on knowledge, a few questions on your experience, and then a majority of the questions were like, if you were a farmer, then you answered the crop section. If you weren't, you skipped it. If you hadn't had any property damage, you skipped that section. If you hadn't had a loss in your family, if you hadn't been injured, if you hadn't taken care of someone injured, you lost all of those sections. So, in general, most people answered about 65 questions.
How does your study compare to other places in Asia in terms of the amount of poaching, in terms of the amount of conflict, and
so the direct impacts was part of a much larger study. So this was based on a survey that was designed by the Asian Elephant Specialist Group, and so those 25 questions that were on that survey had been asked in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, India, Vietnam. I think that's it. So that was a group study that's very similar across the whole range. No one's doing this indirect impact study. To my knowledge, there was a couple of people who were doing the vocal interviews, talking to individual people, very small, doing qualitative study, but no one is doing a quantitative study, to my knowledge.
And do you see as much poaching in other places?
Yes, there are definitely pockets of high amounts of poaching. Myanmar is unique in that it's next to China, so a lot of the products go that way, but there's similar issues pretty much throughout both African and Asian range.
Are there elephant breeding programs in their elephant sanctuaries? And if there are, I mean, what's the rate of their program?
They are officially, they're not actively breeding elephants. They're not trying to increase their captive population at all. They're no longer catching elephants. Because of the poaching, there are significant amounts of orphaned elephants, which do get moved into the captive elephant program. And there's also at night, so in these elephant timber camps, at night, they let all of the elephants go. They have drug chains and collars on them so they can find the elephants in the morning, but there is breeding occurring as the elephants are at all nights.
So the elephant conflict data and the mosquito-borne disease, can you correlate those two kind of quantitatively? Does World Health Organization report outbreaks of mosquito-borne disease? So you can show that?
So there was one paper that I found that actually did say that they found higher amounts of these diseases in areas and people who were crop guarding at night, but also I'm not entirely certain how they did this. I don't remember that as much, but they had elephants are ecosystem engineers, so they will dig up areas, they will knock over trees, but also when it's really wet outside, when they step into the ground, they create these like massive divots that are like this, which are a pain to walk through. But you're going through, those fill up with rain during certain times, which then provide breeding grounds for mosquitoes. So that's what they were particularly kind of looking at, and they found it. I don't think their sample size was high, but was one published.
I was curious about the politics. So if they're endangered, like why are people still allowed to own them and like use them for labor and stuff?
It's like having them in a zoo. We have endangered animals.
Like private individuals or like
they're part of the program. They are monitored very closely. Whenever an elephant dies, they send out a government vet to note the reason. And so they're also required to submit medical records. When we're at the camps, the vet comes out once a month and examines every single tracks, like they do measurements, etc. So they are not always well taken care of, but they are well monitored.
Have there been reintroductions of any captive ones or any studies on like successful reintroductions?
They've tried to do some in Sri Lanka, I think. And to my knowledge, they have not been successful because they don't stay where you put them. So they usually go back, or it's called Elephant Jail in Sri Lanka inside of one of the national parks where they put these males that they were that got displaced from an area, try to put them in there, and usually they kind of like run around and then until they can work out. Part of the project that they're working on, I'm not working on as much of the reintroduction. There is Dr. Schiffer Goldenberg. She's doing all of the behavior that's necessary, behavioral training. So she's looking at putting together family groups that will be successful and stick together, healthy herds, so that when they go into a place, you're not dumping 6 animals who don't know each other into a brand new landscape. Last time I talked to them, the ideas were potentially to be fencing them into an area for an extended period of time until they establish themselves and then removing the fence. That would be years. Okay. Anyone wants to see elephant color? Yeah. Where are you living?
The Woodlands.
Okay. Yeah, but you have a car?
I do, yeah. But I'm taking the bus.
Oh.
Yeah. It's not too crowded now.
No, it's good. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. It's nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
What's like the lifetime? I mean, it depends on the
5
fixed rate.
years. 5 years for a 4 times a day. The issue is we can keep the battery on, but they wear through it. But they wear through it. They rub up against the trees. So these ones, I think it's $700. So when we all in with like renting the captive elephants, etc. And then they die. Yeah, that's fine.
That's what I use
For elements.
Yeah, we're just species dependent.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
We use them for endless or but
Who else makes a big shot?
another tracking company. After a while, they're tracking. After a while, they're tracking.
One of the things about that I was in
But they the family was like keep it and something so metal and not shake and
everything from that carcass. It wasn't like the actually it's not even part of the live animal.
Oh, it was a company that tracks kind of pizza for they all died.
Large quantity. Yeah. Especially villages cannot.
No.
Villages cannot keep it because they do not have the legitimate.
This one's dead.
Bring that to all
Sure. But then just telling this is only half the weight.
Yeah.
The smoke cut, it's just like slowly higher. And they'll just try.
Yeah, because number one, you have infrastructure for it. Number two,
that was one thing. The elephants, the one elephant that I was able to go and see in the field that had been poached, I wanted to retrieve the collar from it. He was so swollen that it was like around and they couldn't get the knife in and couldn't cut it. So it took them like 4 hours. And just like when they handed the collar to me afterwards, it was just like, support from the local people. Do you work with them? And so I hire them to actually do the field DNA project. So I try to hire local people as much as possible. Back into the community.
yeah, I don't have them poached even.
One of the, so my village leader, I was there, the first year, slept in the guy was like with his family, whole thing. The next year, they catch him. He had
It's very difficult to spot a wild tiger usually. So
and we couldn't go back to that side of the village or that side of like the field site.
who typically is poaching there. It's not actually, like Chinese or anything like that.
We have, so, we're on the street, is that there is one man who is like notorious poacher, who is Burmese, and he goes, like, he has different cells, and he'll just like hire you for a job, and like, you go out and tell him what he goes on. Those underlings get caught, but they haven't been able to catch this yet. And it's just like we get these stories, and like, oh yeah, we saw someone like throwing elephant meat into the back of the van, and then
I just want to say good job.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say you're pretty much the same, like more.
No. But the only other thing I want to say is I was up in Front Royal a couple weeks ago. I did a seminar up there. And I talked about grant. I was saying that we should have Endangered.
Yes.
So, like, let's keep talking about trying to promote like grant or other things.
I'm
Down here for seminar
I
students.
have been trying to get Grant and Katie down here, and Chung-Yu, because you and Jared as well. Like every time I went there, I'm like, guys, come down. But also, I just accepted a position at University of Calgary.
Oh, congratulations!
I'm going to be going up there in December.
Okay, so yeah, well, I'll still keep him in mind.
Yeah, well, he's not.
We went to grad school together, so I know him from
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Well, what are you doing in Calgary?
Trout.
Trout. Is it a postdoc?
It is a postdoc. It's so it's two years. They have reintroduction of full trout.
Oh,
so
cool.
it's Steve Amosi. He's the director of the Underground Field Station. So he wants a postdoc to be like postdoc residents out there, and then outreach results with community and then doing this full trout research.
Cool.
So I'm super excited.
Yeah.
That's like my really exciting thing.
Man, it doesn't get better than that. Well, I'm happy for you. That's awesome. Congratulations. Well, we'll catch up.
Yep.
Do you ever feel like a bit desensitized to, like, because you said you're seeing, so like it gets a little, not old, but it doesn't.
It's coping mechanisms. So the first time that I saw the poach